DR spent most of the last Tuesday of her life having her picture taken in various eyeglass frames and costumes in the midst of the Mojave. There were cowboy clothes and guns, and a small airplane. Louise hung around and watched. Back at the hotel during the break, they swam in the pool for a while, but it wasn't the same as yesterday, Louise thought. Dorothy looked unhappy all day, and there didn't seem to be anything to bring her out of it. She laughed once or twice, but Louise could tell her heart wasn't in it, though she had been sweet to her kid sister, anxious that the time shouldn't be unpleasant for her. Yet Louise had seen Dorothy's red eyes that morning, the skin around them puffy. They remained very sad for the rest of the day. Riding back to Los Angeles in the limousine that night, DR kept the inside light on and looked through a stack of fan mail that a Playboy associate had given her. She read the letters of admiration, requests for autographed photos from her Playboy fans, and then she tore them up. One fan, Dorothy showed Louise, had written 3 different letters. She destroyed all of them. A few times she made a noise that sounded like a cross between a grunt and a laugh, but it was so cold that Louise wasn't prompted to ask if something was funny. Her behavior frightened Louise. She had never seen Dorothy like that. The sisters didn't arrive at Copa de Oro until after 9. I could see that DR was tired, but at first I didn't notice anything else was wrong. I was too happy to see her. Later, I perceived a slight distance from me and couldn't figure it out. Perhaps she was annoyed because I had been short on the phone the previous night. I tried to compensate by being over-solicitous. At one point, Dorothy was starting up the staircase to her room as I was starting down to deal with the kids. I stopped halfway to tell her I had been over to Hefner's. She slowed her steps but continued upward and passed me just as I said Hefner told me he had barred Paul from the mansion unless he was accompanied by her. Dorothy hesitated momentarily, did not change expression, and continued slowly up the stairs. I stood watching her, feeling slightly relieved that the news hadn't appeared to upset her. Certainly no one could better gauge her husband's reactions than Dorothy, and she appeared unconcerned as she reached the top of the tile staircase. I told her that Hefner wanted us to come over there together, but that I had put him off. Without a word, Dorothy continued on through the door into her room, so that I had to raise my voice slightly to say that I still did not want to go there. Did she? DR called back, "No, I don't." That night, after the 3 kids had been tucked in, Dorothy lay down on the bed, still fully dressed, ready to hear about the new picture I was preparing. I began to elaborate on what was actually my own way of expressing my love for her. The story of an orchestra conductor and a Dutch girl was transparently about us, but made into a farce. The marriage in the plot was another way of proposing. But as it became clearer to Dorothy where the story was heading, her expression darkened and her eyes grew sad. I was too involved to think it was anything but concentration until I got to the main point. She would play the leading woman. A tremor went through Dorothy's body. Her eyes welled with tears, and a wail escaped her lips. "No." I said her name in surprise. Why had she responded like that? Didn't she like the story? She nodded. Didn't she like the part? Did she think she couldn't play it? She shook her head lightly and asked me to go on with the story. She liked it very much. But her outcry had stopped me. It had frightened me. DR pressed me again to go on with the story. She was smiling now and seemed interested. Her hands and feet still crossed, so I continued. I didn't tell the rest very well. As the hour struck the beginning of Wednesday, August 13th, we began to kiss. Outside there was a thin crescent moon. After a while, DR asked if I minded her taking a shower. She hadn't had a chance. Would I join her? And so, in the early hours of Dorothy's last Wednesday, we took our first and only shower together. We kissed passionately under the hot spray and made love. I again sensed a resistance, a certain reserve, despite the open circumstances, that had not been there since we had started sleeping together 5 months before. Was she doing this just to please me? At around 7:30 that morning, I awakened to find that DR was already up and out of bed, and my mood sank. She had said something about a lot of appointments that day, but I had hoped she would cancel a couple at the last minute and stay close to the house and me. I called out her name, and she walked back from her room into the bedroom. She was wearing a terry cloth robe we had gotten at the Ritz. I asked if she couldn't come back to bed for a little while, and she said it was getting late if we were going to have our morning swim. Hadn't I been saying we should both swim every morning? She leaned down over the bed and kissed me, but it was clear that she was in no mood for romance. I got up and we went down for the swim. Louise came out by the pool in her nightgown and called Dorothy, who stopped swimming and went over to talk to her. We continued our laps, and then she got out and lay in the sun for a while. After a hurried breakfast and several phone calls, Dorothy and Louise left for the day. I tried not to think about my anxieties. She was just busy. Before they left, Dorothy and I had another brief conversation on the staircase. She mentioned that her period was late. Her look into my eyes was penetrating. I asked how late she was. A little over 2 weeks, she said, and continued to look at me. I didn't look away. That wasn't very long, I said. She nodded and said, "We'll worry about it in a couple of weeks." I agreed, and we went our separate ways. As I turned the corner, I wished I had said how much I wanted children with her, how much I loved her. When Dorothy and Louise saw Marilyn Grabowski at the Playboy offices in the early afternoon of August 13th, it had been exactly 2 years since the day they had met. Their second anniversary, Marilyn joked, perhaps remembering for a moment the frightened, shaking teenager who had stepped out of the limousine in an elegant jumpsuit and had tried to act so much older than her years. Marilyn couldn't help noticing how tanned Dorothy was, but she didn't mention it. This was a political meeting for both of them, and they knew it. It was an anniversary for Hefner, too. Wasn't he sentimental about dates? Didn't he keep track of them through his scrapbook? Hadn't it been 2 years since he had been in the jacuzzi with Dorothy? Goldstein would have been happy to report Stratton's first and second stops today. The Playboy offices, and then lunch at Les Dômes with Senior VP and close Hefner associate, Mo Grabowski. Marilyn had been an extremely loyal Hefner employee for years. At one point during the lunch, Louise began to talk about the new house they were staying at, but a cold glance from DR stopped her. Dorothy explained about the apartment she was sharing with Linda. A short while later, Grabowski had to excuse herself to use the powder room, and Dorothy leaned over and reminded Louise of her warning not to say anything to Marilyn about Peter. Louise said she was sorry, she had forgotten. If Marilyn asked her about Paul, Dorothy said, Louise was to say only that everything was fine. Paul was fine, he and Dorothy were good friends. It was the same story Dorothy had earlier told Marilyn. Toward the end of the meal, when Dorothy went to the powder room, Marilyn brought the conversation around to Peter, but Louise only looked at her dumbly. When Marilyn asked about Paul, Louise said Paul was fine. Even though he and Dorothy weren't living together, they were still good friends. Paul Snyder had spent an hour or so that day with his lawyer, Mike Kelly. They spoke of the legalities involved in his divorce from Dorothy Stratton, his alienation of affections suit against me, and his anger at Playboy for barring him from the mansion without his wife, his own discovery. And what was their next move? Would they try to deport him? Try to kill him? Wouldn't he have to buy a gun to protect himself? Kelly tried to calm him down, but it would have been difficult to miss the contained frenzy in Snyder's manner, the anger under the legal talk. Kelly knew Snyder wasn't going to get much more than half of Stratton's current worth, if that. He drew up a legal letter from Snyder to Stratton, as well as a personal management agreement which Snyder was to get Dorothy to sign if he could. Snyder would have figured, accurately or not, that Kelly had easy access to Hefner, Kelly being married to a former playmate. Maybe Kelly would mention Snyder's frame of mind to Hefner, and the chief would reconsider his ban. Snyder was looking for all the options. Hadn't he always? Before the end of the day, Hefner or one of his personal assistants might well have spoken with Kelly and Valerie Cragen, the head of Playboy's model agency, and with Marilyn Grabowski, and would have heard from them. Monday, a fight with her husband overheard by the crew. Tuesday, her new boyfriend tells Hefner they're on cloud 9. Wednesday, the lady herself denies anything but friendship with both men. Had there been any word of Dorothy's going to see her husband or anything like that? Wouldn't Kelly have repeated Snyder's bragging that Dorothy had agreed to see him when she returned from Mojave? Perhaps they all tried to figure out a way to reach Dorothy without Hefner himself having to make the call. Valerie Cragen would have been the obvious choice since the overheard argument, the only hard evidence they could discuss with Dorothy, had happened while she was under the model agency's aegis. Calling my house would have been to betray my confidences to Hefner. For whatever reason, on the doorstep of the apartment at Spalding that early evening of the 13th of August, a messenger left a note from Playboy. It asked only that Dorothy please call Valerie immediately. The word important had been underlined. After the lunch with Marilyn, Dorothy took Louise to the offices of Pollock, Bloom, and Deckham, where she met her new lawyer for the first time. I had recommended him for his integrity. The two sisters sat with Wayne Alexander in his office for almost an hour. Dorothy wanted a clearer idea of her financial situation. What did she have? How much would Paul receive when they divorced? Alexander asked her how long it had been since the two of them had lived together as man and wife. Since long before January, Dorothy replied, but they had been living apart only since March. Alexander said that legally she might take the position that they had actually been separated at least since January, which might make it possible for Dorothy not to be forced to split her moneys from... They all laughed. No, Dorothy said. She didn't want to cut Paul out of that. Alexander tried at length to dissuade her. Hadn't Snyder stolen from her during the summer, after the official separation letter? Dorothy maintained her position. No, she did not want to exclude him from half of They All Laughed. Alexander eventually decided to bring it up again at another time. Did she wish to go ahead now with the formal divorce proceedings? Not yet, Dorothy said. Give him a little time. Alexander would never see Dorothy again. It was in the late afternoon of August 13th that Snyder had his rendezvous at a construction site with the owner of the shotgun. They haggled over price, and Snyder paid with cash. When he requested a demonstration of how the weapon was to be loaded and fired, the owner instructed him carefully. It had cost Snyder less than $200. He was quite pleased with the purchase. Dorothy took her sister into a drugstore to buy her a new hairbrush. Next, they drove to a shoe store where she bought Louise a pair of Capezios. Then she drove back to Copa de Oro. Did Dorothy notice a familiar car or driver in her rearview mirror? A short while later, at 6:30 that evening, A second note from Playboy was left for Dorothy at the door of the apartment on Spaulding. It, too, requested her to call Valerie as soon as possible. The word urgent was underlined. At Copa de Oro, Linda was staying late because I had asked the whole troop out for a Japanese dinner. DR and I had barely had a chance to speak since she and Louise had returned, but when I walked into the kitchen to join the others, I noticed that Dorothy seemed nervous. Her eyes looked frightened as she placed a pie on the table and told me the kids had made it. The last thing in the world Dorothy would have wanted that night, of course, was for the whole family to go out to a restaurant. The 3 children and Peter would be exposed, and Linda and the boys and their girlfriends. Any or all of them could get hurt if Paul really meant what he had been screaming over the phone 2 days before. She had been nervous all afternoon with Louise, especially when they were in the car or walking the streets. But she had tried to hide her feelings so as not to upset her sister or anyone else. Paul was her problem. We piled into 3 cars and the caravan drove through the gates, past UCLA to Westwood and over to Pico Boulevard. Dorothy kept to herself any thoughts about the easy target we presented, and we were so easy to follow. It was the last third of another 16-hour day for Mark Goldstein. He would have parked to watch us cross the wide boulevard and enter a large Japanese restaurant. During the meal, Dorothy was extremely anxious and distracted. Several times I saw her glance nervously at the front of the restaurant, but when I followed her look, I saw nothing suspicious. Was something wrong? I asked her. No, she answered coolly. That same evening, Paul Snyder talked to his 2 photographer friends, Bill and Susan, about the shotgun he had purchased that afternoon. He spoke of playmates who had died or been killed, actresses who had died before their films came out. The ride back to Bel Air was endless to Dorothy. Paul's vicious words echoed in her mind. Back home, she relaxed somewhat. The kids wanted to go swimming, and Dorothy joined them. Linda usually checked the Spaulding apartment before going to sleep at Sean's place. They had fallen in love on the film, but he was out of town. However, Sean's apartment was closer, and since she was tired, Linda drove straight there. The 2 urgent messages from Playboy remained unread that night. As she came out of the pool, DR still seemed agitated. It was a warm night, and there was a moon in the sky. I motioned toward it, and Dorothy looked up. It was the 4th night of the 9th moon of the year, the last one Dorothy would see. We kissed. DR asked if I would like to take a jacuzzi with her tonight, just in case, she thought, things did not end happily tomorrow with Paul. She knew she would have to see him, or he might kill somebody, possibly himself. She would never forgive herself for not trying to save him one last time. Paul was not much worse than a lot of men, Dorothy knew. He was simply not as good at concealing his worst characteristics. Certainly, if she didn't go to see him, something terrible would happen, and Peter or the children might get hurt. Hefner was unlikely to be injured, with all his fortifications and security. Could she jeopardize the people she loved for another day? Anything was better than the one she'd just gone through. If she went to the police, Paul would be deported immediately to Vancouver, especially if he was found with a gun. He would believe even more strongly that she had deceived him. Would he hurt her mother, or Louise when she went back, or John? Would he ever rest before exacting his vengeance? That night, in the upstairs bathroom, I ran the water into the large, almost square, sunken bathtub, tiled in blue and white. It had been equipped with jacuzzi jets, and against the back wall was a large mirror surrounded by tile. There were 4 or 5 red glasses with candles inside, which I lit. A far cry from Hefner's artificial lake and grotto, it was big enough for 2. I gave DR one of my undershirts to make her feel less self-conscious, Maybe it was the glib way I offered it that prompted Dorothy to say, very lightly, with only, I thought, the slightest edge, "Oh, you've done this before, have you?" I told the truth and said I thought it took away some of the romance to just get naked into a tub. But now I felt certain that Dorothy did not really want to take a jacuzzi and was only doing it for me. We changed in different rooms, and I called out to ask if she still wanted to do this. She answered, "Sure," and said she was already going to climb in. I joined her a few minutes later in a pair of boxer shorts. She smiled at me as I stepped in. She was sitting crosswise in the tub next to the faucet. The water beat down beside her. She had pulled the undershirt down to her knees. I had put some bubble bath gel in, and there was a thin layer of white foam. The jacuzzi jets couldn't be turned on until the water level was much higher. I sat down beside Dorothy and kissed her. I could tell that something was wrong. She was not comfortable and her eyes seemed oddly dark. I turned the water up faster and asked if she was all right. She nodded. If we turned on the jacuzzi for more than 3 or 4 minutes, I said, it would exhaust us. DR said she felt tired now. She suggested we make love on the carpets beside the tub and then get back in. I agreed and stepped out to get the bathrobes. Dorothy took off the wet undershirt and stood up into the white robe I was holding and pulled it around herself. I put on a robe. The water ran while we lay down on bath mats and carpet, our robes half opened, and began to make love. When Dorothy looked up at me, I caught in her eyes a sad desperation that frightened me. I suggested we get up and turn off the water and go to bed. She agreed immediately. I got into bed beside her, her warm skin next to mine. We embraced gently and began to kiss again. Even here, in the dimmest light, under the covers, she was not enjoying the lovemaking as she always had before. This was the second day in a row that things did not seem right, and tonight they seemed worse. When Dorothy's eyes opened, she looked sad. I stopped moving, kissed her quietly for a long while, rolled slowly to the side, and lay close to her. After a few minutes, DR rolled me over and moved easily on top of me. She sat up straight, eyes pressed shut. She looked so beautiful and sad in such inner turmoil. Was she torn between her love for me and her love for Paul, I wondered? Had his words destroyed something between us? Did she now believe I was less than she had thought? Yet hadn't she been all right after seeing him last week? What had happened in Mojave? Or was it me? Did she feel sorry for Paul and me? Her eyes were still closed. She would have had to concentrate very hard to block out the terrible fear that we might never be able to do this again. She looked at me lying on the pillow, submitting to what I knew she liked, and she would have known that I was worried. As the clock turned toward midnight, there was a kind of desperation in Dorothy's movement above me. She leaned over and moved her breasts from side to side on my chest, and I had to press my eyes closed for a few moments. When she bent down against me for a minute, I could feel her heart beating rapidly. I held her tightly and kissed her cheeks, her lips, her eyelids. After a few moments, she sat up straight and looked at me, her eyes soft but unhappy. Then she continued to move, and I closed my eyes. When I looked again, Dorothy's eyes were tightly shut, and I could tell that she was about to reach a climax. She moved more and more slowly until at last, eyes still closed, a sound of both relief and woe escaped her throat. I let myself go, and Dorothy fell forward, clasped me tightly, and I held her. Both our hearts were beating fast, and our breathing was heavy. Neither of us moved for a long time. She fell asleep on my chest, and I rolled her over slightly and went to sleep in that position. By the time we moved again, it was 2 hours into Thursday morning. From the last kiss we shared that night, Dorothy had less than 11 hours to live. After we awakened the next morning, she had less than 6. When Doug Dillage came in the kitchen door at Copa de Oro early Thursday, August 14th, he was surprised to find Dorothy seated there, leaning forward over the telephone on the desk. She heard him, looked up, and signaled quickly, finger to mouth, for him to be quiet. As Doug crossed the room on tiptoe and went out the door toward the living room, he glanced once more at DR. She nodded, smiled slightly, and again put her finger to her lips. Dilge later said he took the gesture to mean that the phone call should not be mentioned to Peter. Obviously, she wanted it private, or she wouldn't have used the kitchen. Dilge figured Dorothy had placed the call to a man, probably her husband. My mood was good when I got up, but as soon as Dorothy reminded me that she had a couple of early appointments, it turned gloomy. There was no time to lie around in bed for even half an hour, she said, because we had planned a daily swim and she wanted to sunbathe for a while. It was like a repetition of the day before, except that, when I complained, Dorothy's response was more desperate. Hadn't I said I wanted to swim every morning? Yes, I said, but why didn't she postpone the appointments so that we could have time at least to talk? One was her business manager, she said. The other was a Playboy sitting. She couldn't really postpone either of them now. We took our last swim together, and the kids came out to watch. DR stretched out on a towel in the grass to sunbathe. I went to take a shower. Louise couldn't decide whether she wanted to go along with Dorothy to her appointments or stay with Antonia and Alexandra. Dorothy had told her sister that she was going to see her business manager and then to see Paul and then to a Playboy sitting, but Louise wasn't to tell anyone about the meeting with Paul, especially not Peter, she emphasized, and Louise nodded. Dorothy knew Louise had been bored at yesterday's meetings, so the business manager wouldn't sound very interesting, nor would the Playboy visit. And since Louise had never liked Paul, a rendezvous with him would hold little hope of fun. DR knew her sister too well to forbid her to go to Paul's. Louise was bound to be worried or suspicious. Why shouldn't she go? Better simply to paint a bleak and boring picture of the prospects of accompanying Dorothy and highlight some of the virtues of staying here. Dorothy said she would be back before 2:30. Louise asked her to promise to return by then, and Dorothy promised. Louise said she would stay home. In Vancouver that morning, Nellie awakened with a premonition about Dorothy. She felt more than a little frustrated at her inability to reach either of her daughters in Los Angeles. Her new husband didn't seem very interested in her worries. When the phone rang and it was Louise, Nellie was relieved. Where was Dorothy? She was out swimming, Louise said. Her mother asked for the number. Louise lied and said it wasn't written on the phone, and when her mother pressed her to find someone who knew it, Louise said there was no one else around. Dorothy had instructed her not to give out the number or to mention Peter. They were staying at a friend's until Dorothy's new apartment was ready. Nellie told Louise to ask Dorothy please to call her back as soon as she could, and Louise said she would. When she hung up, Nellie felt anxious again. She stayed home a good part of the day, waiting for Dorothy's call. Louise reported the conversation to Dorothy, who said she would call back that afternoon as soon as she returned. Dorothy hoped that by the time she got back, her mind and heart would be a good deal lighter because she would have finished dealing with Paul, or she would not come back. That thought echoed in her mind every so often, and she felt her knees weaken and her heart tighten. She would talk to herself then to get back her courage, tell herself to be brave and remember the hardships and troubles with men that her mother had survived and that her maternal grandmother had survived. She would make it too. Yet, as she looked at the children and Peter, she realized she might never see any of them again. She had to fight back the tears, fight back even the thought of tears, because if she cried to Peter now, he could make her reveal everything. By the time she said goodbye to him in the kitchen, she had steeled herself against her worst fears. She would simply close off her eyes and mask her feelings. Wasn't that a practice at what she had come to excel? When Dorothy came in to say goodbye that morning, I had just fixed myself cottage cheese with yogurt. We spoke for a moment or two, and DR told me quite coolly not to talk with my mouth full. It wasn't very attractive. She was right, of course, but the force with which she spoke and the darkness in her eyes shocked me. She was sitting on the high stool where 7 months earlier I had first kissed her. I reacted as though she had slapped my face. Okay, I said, and turned away to get a napkin. I had been planning things to do with the kids when she came back in the afternoon and walked over to her as she stood to go, held her arms, and said that everything would be all right. I was sorry to have been grumpy. I understood it was difficult for both of us, but when she returned in the afternoon, we could sit down and talk out the problem, anything that was bothering her. I loved her, I said. Everything really would be all right. The expression on Dorothy's face didn't change, however, nor did her eyes brighten even slightly. Her teeth seemed to be clenched. This was so uncharacteristic of her that it baffled and frightened me. I moved closer, still holding her arms, and tried to look deeply into her eyes. "Baby," I said, "what's the matter?" Dorothy just shook her head and said nothing was the matter. She would talk to me later. The severity of her manner, together with the deep tan she had acquired, made her look much older than her 20.5 years. There was a strain in her face. I shrugged slightly and said okay, and then for a third time I said that everything would be all right. I emphasized each word, and Dorothy nodded again. We kissed one more time briefly, and she turned and walked quickly out of the kitchen toward the front door. I never again saw Dorothy alive. She left the kitchen fighting not to show emotion and knew she still had to say goodbye to the kids. They were playing by the fountain with Blaine and his girlfriend, and Dorothy threw a quick kiss and said she would see everybody soon. Louise, however, followed her to the door and asked again what time she would be back, and made Dorothy promise once more that she would not be home later than 2:30. They hugged each other tightly. Louise held on, but Dorothy pulled away and ran to the car. Louise wondered why Dorothy had almost pushed her from their embrace. As DR stopped her cougar by the gate to check traffic before turning left toward Sunset, Louise noticed that her sister was crying. It was the last view Louise had of Dorothy alive. Linda was late for work that morning. She had stopped by at Spalding first and picked up the 2 urgent messages for Dorothy from Playboy. By the time she arrived at my house, Dorothy had been gone less than 15 minutes. Linda was told that DR had several appointments and was expected back around 2:30. Linda put the 2 notes on her desk along with a couple of other things for Dorothy. In business manager Bob Houston's office, the phone rang while Dorothy was there. It was Snyder. Houston took the call in the next room. Yes, Dorothy was there with him now. Snyder asked if she had told Houston about the house yet. What house? Houston asked, and would remember thinking how especially cheerful Snyder sounded. It smelled phony to Houston. Eventually, Snyder asked to speak to Dorothy. Houston brought her to the phone and went back to his office. The call lasted barely 3 minutes, and when she returned, Houston told her that she didn't have to put up with those calls and that she most certainly didn't need to go down and see him. No, it was all right, Dorothy said. They had an understanding now. He had been upset. Houston shook his head. All Snyder wanted was money and the green work card, Bob said. Dorothy nodded. Houston asked if there was something about a new house, and DR said she didn't know of one. Houston told her again that he really didn't think she had to see Paul. Bob Houston believed that Dorothy owed Snyder exactly 0, since every idea he had ever heard Snyder express had been terrible. When he first met both of them 9 months ago, Houston had known the marriage was crumbling. Everybody did, including Paul. Houston also knew Dorothy was going with Bogdanovich, though she never mentioned it. He and the rest of the firm had known since late spring. All the more reason why, Bob felt, Dorothy's husband was now solely a business and legal problem and certainly should not concern her emotionally. It was costing her enough financially. Smiling sadly, Dorothy kissed Bob on the cheek when she left. All day, whenever he thought of Dorothy, Houston felt strange. He did not realize he would be the last friend to warn her about Paul Snyder. When she left Houston's office that morning, Dorothy had less than 90 minutes to live, less time than the length of an average movie. At nearly the same moment, Playboy put out another urgent call for Dorothy Stratton. The 2 messages at Spalding had been picked up, but Dorothy still had not returned the call to the head of Playboy's model agency. Linda was out of the office when Playboy phoned, and our new accountant, who knew nothing of the politics involved, answered the phone. When the Playboy secretary asked for Dorothy Stratton, the young accountant told the truth. Dorothy had gone out about an hour and a half ago and wasn't expected back until mid-afternoon. Did anyone know where Dorothy was at the moment? No. Did Playboy care to leave a specific message? Yes. Please ask Dorothy to call Valerie Cragen at Playboy Models as soon as possible. It was extremely important. Mark it urgent. When Linda was told of the call, she became uneasy. Playboy calling here for Dorothy? She knew that both DR and I were officially denying our relationship, as well as Dorothy's living at my house. What could be so important that it would make Playboy obviously blow our cover? Late that afternoon, on the call sheet Linda left for DR, she made special note of the Playboy messages and the call. She put quote marks around the word urgent. By the time Playboy had finally phoned Copa de Oro, Dorothy was already on her way to Clarkson. She stopped at her bank on the way and cashed a check for $1,000. Maybe Paul would be happy with not only the gesture but the cash, since he was usually broke. At Clarkson, Snyder was waiting impatiently for Dorothy's arrival. She had said 11:30, but by 11:45 she still wasn't there. Patty and Snyder's main girlfriend, Lynn, had cleaned up the place in the morning, vacuumed and tidied up in readiness for the grand confrontation Snyder had been planning. Dr. Kushner had gone to his office at the usual time, leaving his dog pinned in the back. At around 11, Patty and Lynn had gone out shopping. Snyder said that if he didn't meet them down town by 2:30, they should call. He would certainly be finished by then. Goldstein might have been following Dorothy since she had left Copa de Oro, but he would later admit only to having seen her park her car and walk into the house. She wore slacks and shirt and flats and carried a large zippered purse. Once she was inside, Goldstein claimed to have driven off and called the house at 12:30, at which time Snyder told him breathlessly that everything was going well. Goldstein then drove by it too, and seeing the car still there, drove off again and didn't return until much later. At the Playboy studio, Mario Casilli and the staff were waiting impatiently for Dorothy's arrival. She was already a half hour overdue and had never been late for a session before. Well, Mario said, maybe Dorothy had finally gone Hollywood. Dorothy would certainly have been frightened walking up to the house on Clarkson, the last place in the world she could have wanted to be. But there was nothing to be done now. Though her heart would have been beating hard, she would have taken a deep breath and gone up to the bell and rung it. Whatever would happen, she could handle it. But she wasn't going to give in to his bullying and his tantrums. She had a right to her own life. They could be friends, and he could have half her money, and she would help get him a green card and do whatever she could about Playboy. But she wasn't about to ask Hefner for a favor, and Paul knew why only too well. Didn't her presence, after all his threats, show him how much she cared for him? Why couldn't he trust her? They didn't have to sleep with each other to be friends. What exactly happened between the time Dorothy Stratton entered the house at noon on August 14th and the time, hours later, when she and Paul Snyder were found, both naked, both of their faces blasted by a shotgun? The cause and times of their deaths would turn out to be among the few facts that could be definitely established. Dorothy was dead by 1 p.m., and her killer was dead by 2. What occurred in that last hour of Dorothy's life, and the last 2 hours of Snyder's? There was enough evidence to prove without doubt that Snyder used the bondage machine to strap down his estranged wife and rape her, and that he also sodomized her so forcibly and with such brutality that it literally tore her body apart. The pain that the sodomy caused her would have been the most excruciating torture. After shooting away the left side of her face, Snyder apparently moved the body a number of times, holding her head up by the hair. He had rear entry intercourse to orgasm with the corpse, before scrawling a terse note that blamed Mike Kelly and Lynn for not keeping a better eye on him. Then he turned the shotgun on himself and blew his face away. Outside, the only sound the neighbors recalled was the doctor's German shepherd. He barked and howled and whined throughout the afternoon. Louise was the first to tell us Dorothy had gone over to see Paul that morning. She let it slip around 6 in the evening. We were sitting in the kitchen, and she must have read the worry in my eyes. She could not hold it back any longer. I was trying to be casual, but when I heard the words, an icy chill went through me. She said she was going over to Paul's, but I wasn't supposed to tell anyone. And then Louise was afraid her sister would be angry with her, she said, for telling. She had been especially insistent that Louise not say anything to me. The first thing I thought was that I had lost her to Paul. The second thought was that the first thought was ridiculous. Dorothy may have been irritated with me this morning, but there was too much between us for her to believe I had changed my mind. I had once or twice been slightly apprehensive that she might go to Snyder out of compassion. She had a self-sacrificing nature. But in recent months she had certainly seen what kind of man he was. I didn't want Louise to worry. Dorothy hadn't told her yet that she and I were lovers. I asked Louise to tell me what DR had said exactly, and she repeated the words that after her first appointment she had to go over and see Paul for a while, but would return by 2 in the afternoon, 2:30 at the latest. Don't say anything about the meeting with Paul, especially, she said it a couple of times to Peter. That whole day I had a nagging, sickly feeling. The hours inched past, 1 second at a time. No call, no call, no call. Every minute the thought was there. Where was Dorothy? Was she all right? Was she unhappy? Why didn't she call? There were phones everywhere. It wasn't like DR not to call. Every minute the only thing I wanted in the world was for the phone to ring and to hear Dorothy's voice. I heard it several times in the back of my head. She was sorry. She had got stuck and couldn't call. She'd be right home. At the pool table I worried out loud. Blaine Novak was playing a round of 8-ball with the girls. Our friendship had cooled since I had met Dorothy, but both of us were on our best behavior, hoping to have a pleasant summer. Novak was staying at the house with his new girlfriend, and his buddy Doug Dilge had moved to Los Angeles with his wife and child. He was usually at Copa de Oro, too. It was before Louise had let her secret out that Blaine looked up from a pool shot, grinning. "What's the matter?" he said. "You worried you're never going to see her again?" Antonia picked up quickly on his note. "Yeah, Dad, she's not dead." I nodded quickly. I didn't like her saying that, though I behaved as casually as I could. By then, Dorothy had been dead for more than 4 hours. Later, at the kitchen sink, I asked Dilge if he had any idea where Dorothy might be. Doug had worked on the movie too, and although that morning he had surprised Dorothy on the kitchen phone, he would not tell me about it for another couple of hours. He figured she was talking to Snyder, but at the sink he leaned over and the only thing he said was, "Any girl I ever knew that didn't show up when she said she would was out getting laid." I nodded vaguely and moved away. I had begun to think Dorothy had been so upset by our minor argument in the morning that perhaps she had had an accident in her car, or maybe she was driving around reconsidering her decision to live with me. When Louise first told me about Dorothy's secret appointment, I asked Linda to call Paul's house, and if he answered, just politely give her name and say she was looking for Dorothy. There was no answer at Snyder's. I thought at first they were out driving around, talking late at a restaurant. I had been through enough emotional scenes to know they were sometimes difficult to cut short. But then Dorothy had been to see him less than a week earlier, and she had told me about that appointment long before she went. She had felt sorry for him. Maybe that was it. She felt sorrier for him now. Was she leaving me? The question was in Novak's eye and Dilge's. Had she gone back? It didn't make sense. At around 7 in the evening, Novak offered to drive over to Snyder's house with Dilge to check out the situation. No, I said, that might make it more difficult for her at the moment. I saw the 3 girls to bed around 9:30. For the first time, my kids asked Louise to sleep with them in their room, and Tony even volunteered to take the floor. Perhaps everyone thought that if they behaved properly, Dorothy would be back by the time they woke up. Louise said she was really angry at Dorothy. She had promised to be home by 2:30, and she didn't break her promises. She should have called. I kissed each of them several times. It was a nightly ritual, but I held on a little longer tonight. Novak, Dilge, and I went to the other side of the house and watched television, trying to pretend nothing was wrong. I kept telling myself we would hear from her any minute, but the phone didn't ring. Sometime after 11:30 it finally did. My heart jumped and I smirked, reaching for the receiver. Novak nodded smugly while Dilge grinned and turned the TV down. But it was a man's voice on the phone, Hefner's. I recognized it immediately. When they heard he was calling, Novak and Dilge looked at each other. I was still grinning. My tone was light when I asked how he was. His voice stayed quiet. Haven't you heard? No. Heard what? Hefner said, Oh, God. I asked, still casual, what was the matter. There was a short pause, and then I heard Hefner say, Dorothy's dead. The phone receiver slipped out of my hand and clattered to the floor. Novak asked what had happened, and Dilge stood up. I rose, but couldn't make more than 2 or 3 steps before I fell on my knees near the closet. I cried out loudly. Dilge asked what it was. I mumbled, She's dead. Novak said, What? And I screamed it, She's dead! On the floor, I curled into a ball and clawed at the door of the closet. That night in Vancouver, when Nellie went to bed, still worried because she hadn't heard from Dorothy, she noticed something that later would haunt her. Dorothy's pugnacious little dog, whom she called Bibi, missed her so much that he always slept at the foot of the bed in Dorothy's old room, whether Dorothy was there or not. He never spent the night anywhere else. And yet, that Thursday night, he had come into Nellie's room and curled up on her bed instead, whining sadly. Nellie couldn't understand what was the matter with him. He whined again as though he were sick. She wondered if Dorothy had received her last letter yet, the one she had sent to New York on July 10th. No doubt Dorothy would call tomorrow and Nellie could ask. But her daughter never received the letter. It was forwarded by the hotel to Bob Houston, and by the time he received it, Dorothy was dead and he didn't know what to do with it. Nellie had written in ink on 2 sides of a piece of white paper and even along the margins. The salutation was in Dutch. It meant, Dearest sweetheart. Lieve Lieveling, thank you for your nice letter, Dorothy. I love you. I hope Paul leaves you with some money. Please, Dorothy, if you are broke, I send you money. We will always be here to help you. You know, don't you? Listen good to your lawyer. Ask him questions, because Paul has nothing to lose anymore. I know you are getting a lot more surprises, darling, and hurt feelings. He is going to ask you to support him yet. Ask your lawyer your rights, okay? And also ask the lawyer what to expect from Paul and how to stop him from draining you completely. Be strong, darling, and I know you will come through with flying colors. I told Louise that she could come around the 10th of August. She is happy. I wished, darling, I could have stopped you from all that hurt, but I could not. God knows why. All I know is we all love you and be here to help. Mom. The following morning at 9, Nellie was in the kitchen when the Canadian Mountie came to her door. The murder had been reported in the early hours, but the Mounties had decided to wait until after breakfast to tell the mother. She was at the sink and saw the young man step out of his car and walk toward the house. She wondered if maybe Johnny had been up to something again. When she opened the door, the Mountie told her there had been an accident. To her son? Nellie asked. No, the Mountie said, to her daughter. Nellie wanted to eliminate the worst possibility and asked in disbelief, Is she dead? The man nodded and said yes. Her husband killed her yesterday afternoon. Dazed, Nellie asked the young man to come in. The Mountie entered and helped her dry the dishes. He told her in more detail what had happened. Nellie heard the words, but didn't really believe any of it. That same morning, my friends and the Playboy staff arranged to fly Louise back to Vancouver. Goldstein had called Polly in the middle of the night and told her what had happened. She called Antonia. I was upstairs under sedation. Nellie's new husband took command and said that Louise must be with her own family when she heard the news. It was decided to tell her that Dorothy had to go to New York and that Louise would have to fly back to Vancouver, accompanied by a lady from Playboy. Linda spotted the story on the front page of the morning newspaper that was lying in the limousine and asked the driver to hide it. The Playboy woman took the same precaution on the plane. Louise kept asking about Dorothy and said she was very angry at her for not calling. After Louise had gone, Sashi was told the truth. She made no sound, but tears began to run from her eyes. At the Vancouver airport, Nellie and the new husband met Louise, who chattered on about Dorothy and the unexpected trip to New York. Back at their house, when John came in and found several friends there, he was told about Dorothy and began to cry. When Louise arrived and handed him a couple of greeting cards he had asked Dorothy to buy for him, John threw them savagely into the fire. Louise was shocked. Nellie told her then, but Louise laughed and refused to believe it. She knew that Dorothy was in New York. Nellie pointed upward and said Dorothy's New York was now in heaven. Louise shook her head. Oh, no, Mommy. On that terrible night we learned of her death, Sean Ferrer drove through the darkness to L.A. in the Lincoln convertible that Dorothy had ridden in on the day of its purchase in New York, and, though the doors were secure and the wiring intact, the inside light kept going on and off. It never did that again. A couple of days later, the 3 lights on my office blinked on and off twice while I was reading to John Ritter from Private Lives. The first time followed the line, "Death's very laughable, such a cunning little mystery, all done with mirrors." Just as I closed the book, it happened again. 5 minutes later, after I made a remark to the effect that women are essentially superior to men, the lights went off and on a 3rd time. They never did that again. I made several trips to New York and to London to return to places where Dorothy and I had been. I flew to Vancouver and to Amsterdam to meet her maternal grandmother. I came to understand that a major part of me had died, that the only hope for survival was through knowledge. Perhaps there had once been a time when the good did not die young. At the London Ritz, in the same suite DR and I had shared, the middle-aged chambermaid remembered me and asked happily, "The lady come with you?" "Not this time," I said. On the table was a new hotel ashtray with a drawing of a unicorn and a lion. Recalling DR's last reference in London to our town, I bought a paperback copy and read again of 18-year-old Emily, who dies in childbirth, but whose spirit attends her own funeral, where she watches her weeping parents and the young husband who falls sobbing at the foot of her grave. Helpless, Emily begs to return, just for a single day. She is warned not to try. Knowing the future as she lives the past is too painful. But Emily pleads for just one unimportant day, her 12th birthday. The magic of the theater takes her back, but not for long. It is agonizing. Even the smallest detail breaks her heart, for in that day, as they had all lived it, none of them had realized how truly precious the time was. I can't, Emily cries. I can't go on. It goes so fast. We don't have time to look at one another. She sobs, knowing she can never bear to return again. Goodbye, goodbye, world, she says, and asks the stage manager, do any human beings ever realize life while they live it? Every minute? No, he answers. The saints and poets, maybe. They do some. Sean accompanied me, and Audrey met us in London to record some replacement lines of dialogue for the movie. She asked if I didn't find it distressing to stay in the same rooms I had shared with Dorothy. No, it brought her presence closer, I said, and the memories were all happy. There were tears in Audrey's eyes as she looked at me and said, It's strange. I never really knew Dorothy, but it's as though she just came down long enough to make this picture, and then she was gone. On the morning of my last day in the hotel, the wind blew the pages of a book of Coward's plays past my mark, and I noticed that the 2 pages at which it had stopped contained references to the Serpentine. I went back to the river. There were very few people now, the weather cloudy and cold. The band was gone and there were no rowboats. I lay down in the same place near the old tree where we had laughed so deliriously. Could it have been only 6 weeks ago? 42 days? The sun broke through the clouds for the first time, and the sudden warmth brought Dorothy back. At Heathrow, the airline's computer screen malfunctioned. Although I had an aisle seat, on their TV diagram a light appeared indicating someone seated to my right. Yet the plane had no seat there. The attendant was puzzled and asked his supervisor to take a look. They agreed that nothing like this had ever happened before. Both scrutinized the tiny light, then punched several buttons, reprogrammed the computer, tried again, and found the light still there. Eventually I was told there was nothing to worry about. My seat was on the aisle, and, no matter what the screen said, nobody could be seated in the aisle. It was comforting to know that the little dot of light stayed on throughout my trip home. I remembered the book of cards DR and I had read together, and how Dorothy's card, which was next to mine for 1980, had suddenly vanished from the row. Had it truly been in the cards? When I returned to the book, however, and studied its formulas more carefully, I found that I had been mistaken. Our cards were closely aligned, one way or another, for the rest of my life. More than a year after Dorothy's death, my sister Anna finally explained to me the reason for her bizarre present of a bow and arrow on my 41st birthday. It had been inspired by a strangely frightening experience Anna had had in late July, a little more than 2 weeks before the killing. A friend of hers had done a tarot card reading on Anna and on me, and the key card that turned up for me had scared them both. The tower struck by lightning. The card meant that something was going to happen to her brother, Anna's friend told her, that would shake him to his roots, rock his foundation. He would survive, the woman said, and perhaps be stronger as a result, but the event would leave him profoundly changed. And so, fearing some unknown violence, Anna had unconsciously bought for me the only weapon she could afford or tolerate, a bow and arrow. Wherever I went, memories of Dorothy flashed through my mind. The way she looked in the early morning light, after we had finished a long night of shooting and she had taken a short nap. I remembered her coming out of the brownstone on 10th Street, wearing a white cotton shirt, blue jeans, and no makeup, her hair down. She was most beautiful then, at her most natural. Even with drowsiness in her eyes, she had the freshness of summer flowers and seemed to meld with the wind as she walked. We would grin foolishly at each other and climb into the station wagon for the ride back to the hotel, the sun appearing over the horizon before us. Or the time we sat on the bench by an old baseball diamond in Central Park and watched a woman trying to get her dog to return to her. The dog was off with a female in heat. DR smiled, sympathetic to both the woman and the dog. each of them equally desperate. My arm was around Dorothy, holding her shoulder tightly. We smiled at each other when the woman and her dog were finally reunited. How unbelievably peaceful and lovely the world had seemed. I listened repeatedly to the tape of a Mozart clarinet concerto that Dorothy and I had bought in London. The key refrain suggested to me a profound yearning for the kind of transcendent romantic passion we had experienced together. It moved me to tears long before I discovered that the concerto was one of the last works Mozart completed before his death at the age of 35, the death over which DR and I had cried in London. I often recalled the moment Dorothy had noticed a framed French cartoon hanging near our bedroom at the house. It was a 19th century drawing by Daumier of the Habsburgs, of the then current Austrian royal family. King, Queen, Princess, and Crown Prince, all four sketched as overgrown, retarded children playing house and war. Most people had appreciated the cartoon's icy, satiric brilliance and its artistic genius, but nobody I knew had reacted as Daumier would have wished. No one had ever laughed out loud as Dorothy did. How much experience she had had with immature adolescent behavior to have recognized the character so swiftly. Most of the men she had met had never left their teens emotionally. On a visit to Nicola's, I went to the men's room, the walls of which featured color photos of naked women. Glancing down to my left, I noticed a color picture of Dorothy. Naked, half reclining, her eyes sad beyond words. I looked deeply into them and saw how she had felt at that moment. I glanced up. Above the urinals were other naked pictures of Dorothy. I had never noticed them, but now I saw 4. In each, she looks trapped, forlorn. The door opened and Nicola walked in. When I told him he ought to take down all the pictures, his tone was apologetic. Yes, he knew. I remembered the photo in one of Dorothy's layouts. She stood naked in the sun, a horse behind her, hands straight down by her side. There, the look had said. She was naked, but she could stand it. This would soon be over. Had Dorothy been pregnant with our child when she was killed? A discarded sanitary napkin had been found on the floor of the murder room, but indications were that it contained no menstrual blood. Had DR put it on the morning of August 14th, fearing that Snyder might try something and hoping to use her period as an excuse? She said nothing to me of its having arrived. The coroner's autopsy gave no indication of menstruation or pregnancy. There was no way to be certain then, one way or the other, and I feel confident Dorothy herself didn't know when Snyder murdered her. 9 months after the killing, Earl Ball was up visiting from Nashville. At the piano one afternoon, we composed the music for a song called Unicorn, in which, though all the unicorns are killed, the prettier the prize, the shorter is its life, their spirits live on for those whose dreams are pure and love their only care. While we were working on the tune, a calico cat came in off the street. She was spotted, white, reddish, and black, and she lounged around listening to the music. There was an odd-shaped marking by the right side of her nose, and I kept thinking she looked familiar. Then I realized why. For Easter 1980, Dorothy had given me a greeting card with a photo of a calico kitten. I looked at it more closely and saw that it was spotted, white, reddish, and black, with an identical marking by the right side of its nose. Our visitor never left. If Dorothy's life had ended, the exploitation of her had not. Her fame and notoriety had just begun. The law allows public figures to be portrayed in any medium. Dead public figures, unless they have made legal arrangements about their right of publicity, have no rights whatsoever, nor do their heirs have much recourse to fight the exploitation. After the murder, Private Detective Mark L. Goldstein would try to peddle what he knew or had obtained to whoever would pay, and many would. If he had photos of the murder scene, these did not sell. John Riley, who saw the police photos, said he wished he hadn't looked at them. But in his booty from the killings, Goldstein possessed personal papers, the aborted memoir, and Dorothy's poems and letters, all legally under the immediate copyright of her estate. The Police, Playboy, and New West, now California, magazines would have copies of this material several weeks before the Stratton estate or her family were even informed of its existence. 2 months after the murder, Teresa Carpenter of the Village Voice, the first journalist to write a major news article on the tragedy, sent me a short list of questions, which I ignored. Being in no shape to conduct a personal inquiry at the time, I hired a former FBI man-turned-private detective, H. Frank Angell, to investigate Dorothy's death for me. New West assigned a major article on the story to be written by John Riley and Laura Bernstein. Playboy made plans to publish a mammoth Stratton memorial tribute. Elizabeth Norris from Playboy called Nellie in Canada and told her a journalist named Richard Rhodes, who, she said, wrote for Quest magazine, had requested an interview. She asked if Nellie would, as a favor to Elizabeth, break her silence and see Rhodes. Remembering Norris only as a friend of Dorothy's, Nellie agreed. Rhodes arrived, had several long sessions, and eventually told Nellie that his article would be appearing not in Quest magazine, but in Playboy. Mr. Hefner himself was supervising, and only nice photographs would be used. There would be a single rose across the first page. Playboy, through personal calls from Hefner and several of his staff, was also able to solicit family photos before Nellie realized that by cooperating with the Playboy article, she appeared to endorse and support Hefner's magazine and lifestyle, though in fact this was not true. Nellie had never set eyes on a single page of Playboy. Richard Rhodes called me to request an interview. I asked if it was true that the Playboy article would carry no naked pictures of Dorothy. Rhodes said this was not his department, but understood that only tasteful shots were being used, probably just breast shots. I refused the interview. Hefner called me. It was the first time we had spoken since the funeral. He overrode my objections to the naked pictures of Dorothy. After all, Peter, she was Playmate of the Year. Dorothy's lawyer, Wayne Alexander, informed Playboy by letter that they were not to use any of Dorothy's writings, all of which had been copyrighted by the estate of Dorothy Stratton and were now legally controlled and owned by her mother. I eventually acquired the rights to this material. We made agreements with Dorothy's first boyfriend and several members of the Snyder family. Nellie was given a weekly stipend as consultant for the book. After expenses, the bulk of the royalties would go to the Stratton estate. Although Mark Goldstein legally owned no rights whatsoever, MGM-TV paid him $65,000 for the TV movie rights to the life of Dorothy Stratton, based in part on Dorothy's writings, as well as privileged information gained while Goldstein was in the confidential employ of Paul Snyder, paid out of Dorothy's income. Playboy objected to the TV movie at first, but when the magazine and Hefner were treated sympathetically in the script, he gave his approval and support to the production. A popular Canadian singing group named Prism, whose 5 members had met Dorothy only once, recorded an emotional rock song about her. Cover girl, it's such a damn waste. You are more than just a pretty face. I never thought I'd never see you again. In November, Galaxina opened on the west coast of the United States and Canada with 2 large plugs for Playboy in all ads. There was a flurry of letters to editors protesting the exploitation of Stratton's body in the ads. Except for unanimously glowing comments on Dorothy's presence and performance, the reviews were resoundingly poor. The film did not reach the East Coast until March 1981, where it elicited a similar reaction. Business was tepid. In her Village Voice review, Carrie Rickey wrote, "Stratton radiates an otherworldly presence that makes everything else look like negative space. Her radiant remoteness serves as armor against the leering desires of her co-stars. The Stratton aura is generally called star quality. Dietrich had it, so did Marilyn Monroe. Part of the quality lies in the projection of two contradictory effects, invincibility and fragility. The Village Voice piece by Teresa Carpenter, Death of a Playmate, was published in November 1980. It was later syndicated to newspapers all over the world and helped her win the Pulitzer Prize for Journalism. Although Carpenter had to admit grudgingly that Hefner seemed, from her evidence, to have behaved well personally toward Stratton, she concluded nevertheless that his policies and philosophy had been directly responsible for her torture and murder. At the close of the article, Carpenter printed the press statement I had written, which Playboy would also feature toward the end of its piece. Dorothy Stratton was as gifted and intelligent an actress as she was beautiful, and she was very beautiful indeed, in every way imaginable, most particularly in her heart. She and I fell in love during our picture and had planned to be married as soon as her divorce was final. The loss to her mother and father, her sister and brother, to my children, to her friends, and to me is larger than we can calculate. But there is no life Dorothy's touched that has not been changed for the better through knowing her, however briefly. Dorothy looked at the world with love and believed that all people were good down deep. She was mistaken, but it is among the most generous and noble errors we can make. The Voice article terrified Hefner. He phoned to ask if I had read it. I told him I hadn't. The story's main point, he reported, was that I had been in too much of a hurry, a summation effectively calculated to sting me with his own guilts. He asked for my cooperation on Playboy's article once more. I refused, and we never spoke again. In December, director Bob Fosse bought the movie rights to the Voice article for $130,000 and wrote his own script. The Ladd Company would produce for distribution by Warner Brothers. Fosse titled the picture after the license plates Snyder had specifically ordered for the Mercedes that Stratton bought for him. Star 80. When told by New West reporter John Riley of the director's plans, Hefner grinned and, alluding to Fosse's reputation as a director of musicals, said, "Does that mean I get to dance?" Riley and Bernstein's article for New West, called The Girl Next Door is Dead, was paid for, but never published. The authors were told that The Voice had scooped them, even though their piece was more thorough and more detailed, with far more damning documentation on Snyder and the other principals in the drama. After the article was canceled, negotiations were concluded for Riley's and Bernstein's research to be sold to Playboy. The promise of subcredit with Rhodes failed to materialize, and much of their reporting was cut out. Many of the questions they brought up remained unresolved. The first Playboy article appeared in May 1981, printing without permission several lengthy, if carefully edited, quotes from Stratton's aborted memoir. In its acknowledgments, the magazine incorrectly listed both the name and date of the copyright. When the Stratton estate threatened to sue for copyright infringement, Playboy offered $15,000 for retroactive one-time-only rights. Nellie agreed to the settlement. "They killed my daughter," she said. "What more can they do?" The Playboy article carried family pictures, an in-depth interview with the mother, and excerpts from Dorothy's seemingly glowing memoir about the Playboy way of life. Hefner, who was known to have personally supervised, edited, and largely rewritten the piece himself, was painted as a concerned father figure, and the barring of Snyder from the mansion was stated as occurring months, not days, before the murder. Hefner made a point of prominently quoting a New York gossip columnist's remark about me to the effect that Snyder had shot the wrong person. In November 1981, MGM-TV's Death of a Centerfold, the Dorothy Stratton story, aired over the NBC network with Jamie Lee Curtis as Dorothy. At the family's insistence, the names and relationships of her mother and sister were altered. My name was also changed. The reviews were negative, the ratings unremarkable. It finished 27th for the week, but several million people were led to believe that what they were seeing was the true story. The film would be rerun in the summer of 1983 and finished fourth for the week. A credit at the end of the show read, Technical Advisor Mark Goldstein. Toward the end of 1981 and the beginning of 1982, They All Laughed opened to mixed notices in the United States and Europe. I paid $2.8 million to buy back the picture from Time Life and 20th Century Fox and to distribute it through my own company. John Ritter had suggested that we dedicate the picture to Dorothy, and a simple card was inserted in each print. If the comedy for us was no longer funny, at least this movie gave people an opportunity to see how Dorothy had looked and behaved, how she had dressed and moved and spoken. Despite 3 top-billed stars, Audrey Hepburn, Ben Gazzara, and John Ritter, most newspapers and magazines around the world ran photos of Dorothy to illustrate their articles. In Newsweek, Jack Kroll concluded his review, "It's heartbreaking to see the promise of Stratton," whose stunning face ironically evokes Stendhal's line, "Beauty is a promise of happiness." In the Los Angeles Times, Kevin Thomas wrote, "Stratton was indeed something special, a funny, irresistible lady who could convince us she hadn't the slightest idea of how beautiful she really was." Stephen Schaefer in Us magazine seemed to sum up best most audiences' reactions to Dorothy. Stratton's tragic history makes her every line and appearance an emotionally mixed occasion of helpless joy and sadness. Although the first Playboy Memorial tribute ran no naked pictures of Dorothy, subsequent coverage in other issues did. Playboy also sold picture postcards of her naked. They prepared a video cassette and cable TV tribute featuring never-before-seen naked footage. By the spring of 1984, the financial matters of the Stratton estate were still not settled. Snyder's father, through Snyder's lawyer, Michael Kelly, insisted on a 50-50 split, but settled for $5,000 and the Star 80s Mercedes. Nellie asked for a stipulation that the former Mrs. Snyder, Paul's mother, receive half. Nellie said she was the only member of the Snyder family who deserved anything. Almost 4 years after the murder, the killer's family had received the value of $20,000, while the victim's family would likely receive, at most, $5,000. In 1982, Novak and Dilge were associated, respectively, as writer, actor, and producer, with an independently made little picture they told the press was based on observations made during the Stratton-Bogdanovich affair. Though the film actually had nothing at all to do with either of us, the initial publicity helped the production to obtain distribution. A threatened lawsuit from the Stratton estate and me dissuaded them from further use of such publicity. To gain the support of Stratton's family, in February 1982, Bob Fosse wrote her mother a personal letter offering $25,000 of his own money to prove his good intentions. Nellie asked her lawyers to decline and requested that her name and relationship to Dorothy and the names and relationships of her 2 surviving children be altered for the movie as they had been for the TV film. The names have been changed, though virtually unmentioned, but the familial relationships remain the same. Eventually, a financial settlement was made. Although it credits Carpenter's Voice article, the Fosse script in no way expounds the same message, and therefore the Playboy organization lent its full cooperation. Mariel Hemingway plays Dorothy in the Fosse picture, despite the fact that her young boy's body is the opposite of Stratton's lean voluptuousness. Her face bears little resemblance either, but she is the correct age. Hemingway had her underdeveloped breasts surgically augmented for the picture, though this does not make her body look any more like Dorothy's. Jamie Lee Curtis's TV Stratton, though in no way resembling Dorothy, occasionally comes near to capturing some of her strength and wit. She is also allowed to yell at Snyder and fight with him, while Hemingway's Dorothy simply goes along, cow-like and dim, manipulated first by Snyder, then by my surrogate, the quintessentially dumb, even listless blonde. Choosing to tell his story from Snyder's point of view, Fosse cast a charming, good-looking actor, Eric Roberts, in the role. The TV film presents him as a cold and unmitigated scoundrel. Hugh Hefner is played by Academy Award winner Cliff Robertson, well known as a loyal husband and man of integrity. In 1977, Robertson had blown the whistle on the Hollywood Wall Street scandals involving embezzlements and forgeries at Columbia Pictures. As a result of his honesty, movie politics being what they are, he was blacklisted by producers, and Fosse's casting gained respect by breaking the blacklist. Robertson had previously played another living figure, John F. Kennedy. Conversely, the character of Dorothy's mother is played by Carol Baker, an actress whose initial screen persona as a sexpot in Baby Doll was further emphasized by the title of her autobiography, also Baby Doll, which was published simultaneously with the release of Star 80. Mario Casilli, no longer in the girly mag business, offered in Dorothy's memory to assist in getting the nude layouts to look right, and was shocked to find Fosse insisting on the sort of poses to which Dorothy had objected so bitterly. Casilli told Fosse that Dorothy didn't do those kinds of shots, but Fosse was undeterred and Hemingway submitted, though no graphic pubic area shots remain in the completed film. While neither the TV movie nor the Fosse film conveys the truth, the TV version, directed by Englishwoman Gabrielle Beaumont, is somewhat more accurate in recounting certain incidents. Neither film deals with Dorothy's passionate reluctance to pose naked. Though the TV version at least gives her a moment's firm hesitation on the subject, Fosse Stratton leaps into the nude scenes with abandon. His picture, though vastly more expensive, better produced, and far more slickly directed, has less than a handful of moments that ring true. It contains not a flicker of authenticity in its depiction of Dorothy's relationship with me. Fosse leaves out all the laughter and love. How could he have known? One glaring misconception in his movie concerns drugs. Although Paul Snider admitted over the phone to Molly Bachelor, a month before the killing, that he had been heavily into both drink and drugs over the past few months, cocaine in particular, the only mention of drugs in the entire film, there is no drinking, occurs when the Snider character tells the Dr. Kushner character that he thinks I am giving Dorothy cocaine in New York. The doctor stoutly defends us, but the implication remains. The truth is that DR and I tried cocaine together a couple of times, but neither of us liked its effects. Snider had given some to Dorothy previously, but she had never enjoyed it. She would not smoke grass with me and lightly discouraged my using it. She said it reminded her too much of Paul. Every time she had tried it with him, she had become depressed. Another major inaccuracy in Star 80 has my character informed, evidently on the day of the murder, that we have been followed by private detectives. In reality, I knew nothing of Goldstein's activities until late in October, more than 2 months after the killing. One of the questions Teresa Carpenter asked me in her letter was when I first learned we were being followed in New York and Los Angeles. Ironically, the question itself was the first I had heard of it. Had I known sooner, even as late as August 14th, subsequent events might have been different. Bits of the murder sequence are flashed throughout the Fosse picture, like subliminal coming attractions for the main event. When it finally arrives, the result is anticlimactic. Fosse has tastefully avoided much real violence or even the implication of its true horror. His Snider cries and yells, shoves his Stratton down a couple of times, is going to rape her, but stops himself and cries again instead. When Stratton then tries to console him with the gift of love-making, Snider considers it pitying and takes her violently, yet she doesn't appear terribly upset. The corresponding TV sequence is pure rape, as ugly and brutal as television allows. The murder is quick but savage. Fosse Snider seems almost to be committing euthanasia. He is so gentle as he puts the barrel beside her head, and his Stratton barely seems to notice. This is followed by a flash of necrophiliac bondage and intercourse before the Snider suicide. Bob Fosse's movie is all rhythm without notes, fancy footwork and weak surmise, based on insufficient research and knowledge, along with a built-in early decision to create an apologia for the killer. The film's showy mediocrity and repressed misogyny define none of us as much as it does its director and his Playboy collaborators. When Star 80 opened in November 1983, reactions from the media and the public were widely mixed. Business was good at first in New York, LA, and one or two other major cities, but fair to poor and more average markets. Some critics raved respectfully, while others savagely denounced the picture. Vincent Canby of the New York Times, who had panned They All Laughed, gave Star 80 an extremely favorable notice. On the other hand, Andrew Saris of The Voice, who had given our picture an especially glowing review, attacked Star 80. Jack Krall of Newsweek liked both. None of the press or public, of course, had the faintest idea whether the story being portrayed was moderately accurate, largely true, or mainly false, which left them discussing the merits of the picture's style and viewpoint. Some called it extremely moral, others extremely exploitative. Some, like Sheila Benson of the Los Angeles Times, expressed only contempt. I had been shown the film privately in August and found myself alternately appalled, disgusted, bored, and bitterly, though often uproariously, amused. It was the blackest of humors that made me laugh. Fosse trying to have it both ways with Hefner's character, respectable and slightly sinister, at the same time trying to belittle and mock my character, but in such feeble and cowardly terms that only the director emerged pathetic. He had no idea what Dorothy was like, and so portrayed the usual, though more lethargic, dumb blonde of 1,000 fictions. The most preposterous and obscene achievement, in light of the known facts, is Fosse's rendition of the final murderous confrontation. Desperately trying to create moments of sympathy for the killer and irritation with the victim, and thoroughly disregarding the physical evidence in the crime, Fosse reveals his true intentions by softening the circumstances and actions, as one might by altering the church execution of Joan of Arc from burning alive to firing squad. Did the filmmakers realize at some point that even to suggest the truth would constitute not only the ultimate stag film, but a damning indictment of the fake sexual revolution they and so many others of us have endorsed and exploited? Weren't Snyder's actions, finally, an imitation of the stag reels and porno magazines he was addicted to? Wasn't his mind's eye also photographing himself and the most sensuously proportioned of playmates as she was forced at gunpoint to strip, then was taped down, raped, sodomized, murdered, and brutalized even after she was dead? The Stratton extended murder reel, ideal for the 80s. But the filmmakers had tidied up Snyder's act, perhaps to save the face of man. After the murder, Hugh Hefner instructed his staff and the other playmates not to speak to the press about Dorothy. Later, Hefner would not discuss Dorothy in private. He especially wanted no publicity about his relationship with Snyder. Although standard mansion policy was to admit as few boyfriends or husbands as possible, Hefner had made a noticeable exception for Snyder and allowed him to bring in other Dorothys. Didn't Hefner figure that the only way to get Dorothy back was to remain friendly with her husband? Didn't Hefner know the kind of man Snyder was and keep him around as part of a master plan to win Dorothy Stratton for himself? Public Playboy statements emphasized Hefner's barring of Snyder from the mansion months before the killing. For what reason, except to obscure the fact that Snyder had been informed only 5 days before? The question might easily be asked why more discretion and care had not been taken in such a volatile situation. Particularly curious is the wisdom of antagonizing an already angry husband who was capable of doing malicious injury to one of Playboy's major assets. The most popular playmate in nearly 3 decades, well on her way to film stardom, a goal that had eluded the hundreds of other playmates. If Hefner had not been brought up in the strict repressive atmosphere of Puritanism, would he have reacted differently when his girlfriend Mildred broke down from guilt during the Loretta Young movie in the Midwest of the late 40s, and the dark stranger made his first appearance to young Hefner? The great resolution of his life had to be never again to allow this brooding shadow to threaten him, and the one certain way was to himself become the dark stranger in every woman's life. 30 years later, in a London theater, he appeared in that form to Dorothy Stratton, but she protected him as Mildred had not, as he would not protect Dorothy or any woman. Wasn't revenge the grand inspiration for Hefner's millions of pages of photos in print? Wasn't he trying to strip every last vestige of secret magic from the one figure in his life who had so humbled him in his own mind? Hadn't Hefner decided that one way or another he would take every woman he could get and make all of them show everything to the men of the world? The public image Hefner would strive to uphold was that no woman could keep him long, since he was too much the king of women for only one to possess. Wasn't it his goal to prove that he was no pathetic cuckold, but rather the greatest lover who ever lived? Those close to him speculated that Hefner's refusal to talk about Dorothy indicated a sudden awareness of his own mortality. But wasn't it perhaps more a conjecture on his immortal spirit? Hadn't Shaw and Mozart, like all great artists, damned Don Giovanni, Don Juan to hell? In truth, doesn't Playboy figuratively seduce and rape young women, live off them, ridicule their gender, destroy their lives, and monthly instruct and inspire millions of men to follow the Hefner example? It is no secret that some men surround themselves with women because they love them, some because they use them, and some because they fear and hate them. Playboy and its kindred porno mills continue to grind up women and spit them out for the masturbatory pleasure of men the world over. But certainly, to a growing number of women, the magazine and what it represents have become a principal target for condemnation. More and more women, as well as a sizable body of men, are finding the Playboy philosophy at the core of many evils in our society. Gloria Steinem once remarked that leafing through Playboy reminded her of a Jew reading a Nazi manual. DR was a small-town girl who tried, against her better instincts, to be a liberal, modern woman. Neither she nor I had ever really dealt with the difference between the old-world culture of our parents and the ruthless American way we found outside the home. Yet the even newer world Dorothy grew up in was far more confusing and dangerous than mine, since many of the worst enemies of civilization cloaked themselves in respectability. There are impostors behind every post and lectern, and it is difficult to separate the false from the true. Everybody is pushing his own temple. One of the last times I ever spoke to Hugh Hefner, when he tried to convince me that it was all right to print naked shots of Dorothy, and I objected, he said perhaps he had been doing the magazine for so long he had become jaded. To him, nudity was just natural. But this is all a part of the whole problem in the world, of sexual repression and mortality, he said. It's a part of our Puritan background. We have to be more open in these matters. Yet nudity, as revealed in Playboy, through the years has become anything but open or natural. It is not our inhibitions that are unnatural and unhealthy, but our obsessions, and the Puritans were obsessed with sex in a way that is not all that dissimilar from Hugh Hefner. Like them, Hefner's magazine is finally neither respectful nor worshipful of women, but antagonistic to them, and the women themselves, trapped in the half-truths and promises of the sexual revolution as described and depicted by Hefner and his followers, have become its victims. This is evident not only in the myriad cases of manic depression, anorexia, and suicides of women trying to make these visions real, but in the increase of sordid and violent male crimes like the one which destroyed Dorothy. It is evident also in the ways in which these ideas have found general currency. The pervasive exploitation of the female body in a commercial sense, through television, advertisements, and movies, has done more subtle harm. All of this has been the result of Hefner's great con. The last time Hefner and I spoke, he made his comment that I had been in too much of a hurry, a vastly understated way of describing his own behavior toward Dorothy Stratton and his own barring of Paul Snider, two of the central actions that drove her to marriage and Snider to murder. Was it any wonder that Hefner sought so desperately to conceal or disguise these two events, and to pass the blame as self-righteously as possible to others, Snider, Goldstein, Bogdanovich, even Dorothy, for not having come to him sooner? How many others in the past 3 decades has the Playboy philosophy driven to an early grave? On the evening of August 14th, exactly 3 years after her murder, we visited Dorothy's grave and found 7 bouquets, her marble marker adorned all around with cut flowers. There were some notes, one written on a small piece of paper and signed, "A Faithful Admirer." It read, "To Dorothy, wherever you may be, I cannot adequately express my sorrow over your being deceased for 3 years. The world needs people like you. We are all very sorry that this happened to you, and we hope that more people like you don't suffer this fate. You may have left the physical plane 3 years ago, Dorothy, but we will never forget you. Viva Dorothy Stratton." We looked again at the inscription on the stone, a passage I had once pointed out to Dorothy from A Farewell to Arms. If people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them, so of course it kills them. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure that it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. At the bottom were the words, "We love you, DR." A year and a half after Dorothy's death, Louise had a dream. The time was the present. Louise was standing in a large field of grass, and Dorothy was with her, looking exactly the way she had in life. No one seemed to recognize her, or even to see her, except Louise. Many of the Playboy people went by, Grabowski and Casilli and Hefner among them, but they didn't see Dorothy. They were all heading for a vast exhibit at Booth's. More and more people passed the two sisters until finally Louise asked if they could go down and see what the attraction was. DR took her hand and they walked to the most crowded area, where they found a giant photograph of Dorothy naked. The other booths advertised other naked women, but Dorothy's was by far the most popular. Louise began to cry. Dorothy hugged her, crying too, and said, "How can they do this?" Louise looked at all the Playboy people and saw that they had no feelings. She cried out, "I miss her so much." And Dorothy said, "I do too." Then she took Louise's hand and they walked away. Dorothy would give me something to live for, but she didn't live. She didn't know that she did not have to protect me at the cost of her own life. But Dorothy had for some time lived in fear of her own death or the death of those she loved. She felt trapped in a hopeless situation and saw her own sacrifice as the only way out. This was her mistake, but one that many women have been taught to make. As friends and lovers, Dorothy and I had only 10 months, little more than 300 days and nights. Yet even before the murder, I had started to think of my life as before and after Dorothy. Her death, therefore, was either the end of life or somehow had to be turned into the most profound kind of comprehension from which a new beginning might emerge. If only for DR. Hadn't her life been sacrificed so that the people she most loved could live? Didn't we owe her, at the very least, the living out of useful and productive lives? For me, the conflict between reason and emotion was bitter, and the road from one to the other is desperately long and hazardous. To reach an understanding meant experiencing shock and horror, grief and guilt, rage, sorrow, despair, and nothingness. Hadn't DR passed bravely through each of these? Her death spun me into areas of investigation far beyond the promises I had made to myself for years, but had never really expected to fulfill. Now, however, the search was for Dorothy. I felt that her life was the key to an understanding that would help me survive her loss. Was there ever a time when women had not only the respect, but also the supremacy which their better characters and more refined and complicated bodies and minds justified? This was the time in history I had to uncover. Wouldn't I find Dorothy there? I discovered myself on a path marked by Robert Graves. We must retrace our steps or perish. In the mid-70s, Sybil Shepherd had read Graves's extraordinary historical grammar of poetic myth, The White Goddess, along with his definitive collection of the Greek myths, and one evening mentioned to me the essential premise of both books, that the earliest known civilizations had been matriarchal, that in the original beginning, goddess, not God, had created heaven and earth. I remember laughing with a kind of cynical glee at the time. Having already learned by then that fame, success, money, and love were not as advertised by the established order, I didn't even find it particularly surprising that the accepted foundations of civilization were originally quite different too, and that God had once been called by a female name. After Dorothy's death, I read those Graves books and several others of his, along with the many more I had been saving for some rainy day. All the days had become rainy now, and everything I had once taken for granted had to be weighed and examined. I went looking for clues anywhere and everywhere. I flew to Majorca to meet Robert Graves and his family, and discussed with them the mythological resonances in Dorothy's story, as they were illuminated by his studies of the white and the black goddess. I studied works of archaeology and anthropology, of ancient calendar systems and ancient mythology, trying to find clues to the meaning of Dorothy's life and of her sacrifice. I read Bacon's essays and Sophocles, Jung versus Freud, G.B. Shaw and the classical Greeks, studies of early Christianity, the Bible, and books on feminism. I read Virginia Woolf and the poetry of the Sumerian moon priestess Enheduanna, born circa 2300 B.C. I was searching and am still searching. Truth has often been pictured as a naked woman, but the Hefners of the world have turned the truth into the ugliest graffiti, and the Snyders have tried to kill the truth. That one Dorothy was more precious than 10 million Snyders, Hefners, Bogdanoviches, and that if the world must protect anyone, it has to be the Dorothys. Snyder knew the truth, the remarkable power Dorothy had over him, the superiority of her instincts and talent. Why else would he belittle her at every opportunity, as most men will do with women they feel inferior to? Ridicule her appearance, her sense of direction, her business acumen and taste in pictures. Keep her out of focus, knowing she was nearsighted and never suggesting corrective lenses? Tell her she was frigid? Immobilize her in high heels and tight skirts? Kill her because she wouldn't submit? The man had to prevail through whatever means at whatever cost. And yet, when the bestseller comes out, the TV movie or film, the sympathy and understanding is rarely with the victims we have created, but with the executioners. In our age of tolerance and popular psychology, even the worst criminal has to be understood, analyzed, and pitied. We identify not with the victim, but with the assailant. If I had seen little of the sort of attitude and behavior toward women which Snyder exemplified, I had heard stories from other women, and certainly knew long before T.R. was killed that the picture business had become worse for women than it had ever been. Although American women gained the right to vote at the start of the 20s and won more and more equality in the succeeding decades, they seemed to have progressively lost power on the screen. In her unique and brilliant study of women in movies, From Reverence to Rape, published in 1974, Molly Haskell wrote, "Women have figured more prominently in film than in any other art, industry, or profession, and film is all three, dominated by men. The women in movies had a mystical, quasi-religious connection with the public, and women, in the early and middle ages of film, dominated. It is only recently that men have come to monopolize the popularity polls. Here we are today with an unparalleled freedom of expression and a record number of women performing, achieving, choosing to fulfill themselves, and we are insulted with the worst, the most abused, neglected, and dehumanized screen heroines in film history." Among the central reasons, Ms. Haskell cites, the current availability of sex at every street corner and candy store. On the screen, sex has been demystified. The mystery, the goddess, has been removed. Where are we now without our goddesses? In the winter of 1981, Dorothy's family and mine were in New York together, and we all went to visit the cloisters for the first time and to see its famous 15th century French unicorn tapestries. The series traces the hunt, capture, torture, and killing of the unicorn. The tapestries were far too tragic in their implications to keep us there long, for I had learned by then that the first known references to the unicorn, written in the 5th century BC by the Greek historian Tzetzes, describes the colors of its horn as white, red, and black, which are also the colors of the earliest known European deity, the many-titled mother goddess of the great pagan civilizations. Pagan originally meant country. White for innocence, red for death, black for wisdom. The same colors as the calico cat who came to visit while we were composing our unicorn song. The original unicorn was not zoological, but appears to have been a composite creature used as a calendar symbol for the course of the sun, still of female power through the 5 seasons of the year, each represented by an animal particularly sacred to Mother Earth or Mother Nature. The feet of an elephant for spring, the tail of a lion for summer, the horn of a rhinoceros for autumn, the head of a deer for winter, the body of a horse for the new year. The unicorn's number, 5, marks not only the 5 senses. There is a famous series of unicorn tapestries illustrating this, and the 6th sense, intuition, is still a notably feminine characteristic, but also the 4 quarters of the earth and the zenith. The V-shaped Roman numeral for 5, the upside-down triangle, which distinguishes the female pubic hair, is also the most ancient symbol for women. The killing of the unicorn, then, is the symbolic murder of all women. As a kind of condolence, many people said that Dorothy's story would always have ended the way it did, that its outcome was somehow inevitable. Others blamed Dorothy's death on the lifestyle she had chosen, as though she had chosen it or created the world she found, as though Snyder had. And if Hefner had not founded Playboy, perhaps a year or so later someone else would have, because there must be a need in the land, which he discovered the best way to fulfill. Porn from a hygienic super pimp. But what is this need precisely? Is it perhaps a terrible poison eating away at our collective soul? The grand sexual revolution that began in the 50s was in truth a male uprising against women, under the guise of liberalism and equality. Its true purpose was to make things easier for the men to get laid. The women who have survived have great scars to show. The macho platform of the typical Playboy was a promise of unlimited sexual pleasure, but for whom? The women didn't have a much better time, but the men were in a demi-heaven. If a girl said no, he could pull out his liberal modern flag and wave it, and if she still didn't bow to his wishes, he could always use a little bit of force to give her what he had been taught they all want anyway. The big male fantasy is that women like to be raped. The several women I've known who have been raped were traumatized by the experience and have had severe problems as a result in dealing with men and life. The truth is that men like to fantasize about raping women, and the 50s revolution has been a great boon for that urge. Didn't they used to say that the sex mags were good because they would cut down on rape? But rapes have increased at an alarming rate, to an all-time high, especially in America. Also, wife abuse, child abuse, drug abuse, and murder of women by men. In 1983, Harper and Row published an impressive women's encyclopedia of myths and secrets compiled by Barbara G. Walker, the 4-page entry on rape reports. True rape was not common in the ancient world. Like the males of all other mammalian species, the ancients believed sexual activity should be initiated by the female. The modern conventional description of a rapist as an animal is a slur on the animal kingdom. Animals do not rape. Only man forces sexual attention on an unwilling female. The Romans and Saxons punished rapists by death. Normans cut off a rapist's testicles and gouged his eyes out. The Gypsies' Oriental heritage demanded the death penalty for a rapist. Hindu law said a rapist must be killed even if his victim was of the lowest caste and untouchable, and his soul should never be pardoned. The Byzantine code decreed that rapists must die and their property must be given to the victim, even if she was no better than a slave woman. So the world today is an upside-down, backward place, and the only way to deal with it is to emulate what Lewis Carroll's Alice was told by the White Queen, the one who cried before she hurt herself because she knew what was going to happen. No one told us in school that the Alice books are metaphors for daily life. What gives Dorothy Stratten's story a universal meaning is her kinship with all women. Like so many others, she was a tragic casualty of the unequal war between the sexes, born into a world where the holy had become profane and the profane had become holy, where, finally, a rape was reported every 6 minutes, and countless more were unreported or unnamed, where the innocent and good would lie brutally killed at the feet of an evil philosophy's most loyal son. Will the ones who understand tell the ones they love before it is too late for them? As it was for our beloved Dorothy Ruth, born into a world where all the roles are scrambled and all of nature confused. The tale of a woman in the year of our Lord, 1980. Would it have been otherwise if, dating from the first civilizations of the Stone Age, the date had been known as 11,980 in the year of Our Lady? There were a few of us who knew that Dorothy's spirit was with us still, that there would hardly be an hour when she wasn't on our minds, when we didn't wonder, before making a decision, what she would think, when we didn't wish we could see her again, hear her laugh, touch her arm, breathe her freshness, seek her comfort. She was for us the best friend we ever had, and if we achieve anything worthwhile in our lives, it will be for her memory, the glow of which can never fade. Dorothy said it best. Less than 3 months before she was killed, D.R. wrote in a poem to me the most eloquent summation of our love story, the sad love story she had asked for in London. The evening will be forever, yet time was not enough.